Amina was a quiet girl who lived with her mother, Grace, and her stepfather, Daniel, in a small Ugandan village surrounded by tall banana trees and red dusty roads. Their house was made of mud bricks, with a small veranda where Grace sold roasted maize to neighbors. From the outside their life looked peaceful. Daniel was known in the village as a hard-working man. He went to church every Sunday and often helped old people carry water from the well. People respected him and always greeted him with warm smiles. But behind those smiles, something was wrong in their home. Amina, who once loved singing and playing with her friends after school, had changed. She had stopped talking much. She no longer laughed the way she used to, and her eyes looked tired even in the morning. When people asked why she was so quiet, Grace only said, "She's just growing up. She's fine." Grace believed everything was normal, but Amina's silence carried heavy pain. Every morning, Grace woke up early to go to the market. She would pack a small meal for Amina and remind her to do her homework. Daniel would still be at home when Amina prepared for school. He often said kind things to Grace in front of neighbors, but his voice changed when they were alone. Amina began to fear the sound of his footsteps. Sometimes, when Amina returned from school, she found Daniel already sitting on the veranda. He would smile at her, but she would quickly look away. She preferred to stay inside her room or go to the backyard to feed the chickens. Grace, always busy at the market, thought her daughter was just being shy. She didn't see the sadness that followed Amina like a shadow. At school, Amina's teacher, Madam Ruth, started noticing changes too. Amina's grades were dropping and she often seemed distracted. When asked a question, she would stare blankly at the blackboard. "Amina, are you okay?" Madam Ruth asked one day. The girl just nodded and whispered, "I'm fine, teacher." But her eyes said something different, something deep and hurting. One afternoon, while walking home, Amina's best friend, Joy, asked, "Why don't you come play after school anymore?" Amina shook her head. "I just want to go home early," she said softly. Joy didn't understand, but she saw the sadness on her friend's face and felt worried. In the evenings, Grace cooked supper, mostly beans and pasho, and Daniel would sit near the radio, pretending to listen to the news. Amina would eat quietly, her head lowered. When Grace tried to talk to her, she only gave short answers. "How was school?" Grace asked one night. "Fine," Amina said without looking up. Grace sighed and thought her daughter was just tired. But the nights were the hardest for Amina. She often stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes she heard Daniel moving around the house and her body froze. She wished she could run away, but where would she go? Her mother trusted Daniel completely. No one would believe her if she spoke. So she kept her secret locked inside her heart, hoping things would somehow change. The next morning she walked to school slowly, dragging her feet. She passed a group of children laughing near the mango tree, but she didn't join them. When she reached school, Madam Ruth called her aside. "Amina," she said gently, "you look tired. Is everything all right at home?" Amina wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away and said, "I'm just not sleeping well." Madam Ruth nodded, still unsure, but decided to watch her more closely. Meanwhile, in the market, Grace heard people praising her husband. "Grace, you are lucky," one woman said. "Daniel is a good man. Many husbands are not like him." Grace smiled proudly, feeling blessed. She had no idea that the man everyone respected was the reason her daughter hardly smiled anymore. At home that evening, Daniel brought Grace some sugar and tea from town. "For my hard-working wife," he said, handing her the bag. Grace laughed and thanked him warmly. She didn't see Amina standing quietly in the corner, her eyes filled with fear. She wanted to scream, but her lips wouldn't move. Later that night, Grace hummed a song while washing dishes. She glanced at her daughter and said, "Amina, why don't you ever smile anymore? You used to be such a happy girl." Amina forced a small smile and whispered, "I'm fine, Mama." Grace nodded, believing her. As the days passed, the silence between them grew heavier. Amina began writing in her small notebook, drawing pictures of the sun, the sky, and birds flying away. She dreamed of escaping to a place where no one could hurt her. Her only peace was at school, where Madam Ruth's kind voice gave her a sense of safety. But even at school she sometimes zoned out, her thoughts lost in fear. Her friends whispered among themselves, wondering what had happened to her. Joy told the teacher, "Amina cries sometimes when she thinks no one is looking." Madam Ruth felt worried and decided to visit Grace at the market soon. That Sunday the family went to church. Daniel wore his best shirt and people greeted him warmly. "Brother Daniel, you are a good man," they said. Grace smiled proudly. Amina sat beside her, silent. When the choir sang, she didn't join in. She just looked down at her hands and prayed in her heart for God to protect her. After church, the family walked home together. Neighbors waved, admiring them as a perfect family. But inside their small home, love had been replaced with fear and silence. That night, as the crickets chirped outside, Grace sat on her bed, feeling uneasy for reasons she couldn't explain. She looked at her sleeping daughter through the doorway. For the first time, she noticed how thin and pale Amina had become. A strange worry filled her heart, but she pushed it away, telling herself that her daughter would be fine. Outside, the wind whispered through the banana leaves. Inside, a girl lay awake, clutching her pillow, praying for morning to come quickly. And while the village slept peacefully under the stars, no one knew the pain that lived in the quiet home of Grace, Daniel, and Amina. A pain hidden behind smiles, a secret buried in silence. The morning sun rose gently over the hills as children walked to school, their laughter echoing through the dusty road. Amina walked behind them, her steps slow and quiet. Her school bag looked too heavy for her small shoulders, and her eyes were fixed on the ground. She used to walk with her friends, chatting about songs and stories, but now she preferred silence. Even her best friend Joy had stopped waiting for her because Amina hardly spoke anymore. At school, her teacher, Madam Ruth, noticed her again. She had been watching Amina for weeks. The girl who once raised her hand eagerly now stared blankly at her notebook. Sometimes she jumped when someone dropped a book or shouted her name too loudly. Something inside her seemed broken. During the morning break, Madam Ruth called her softly. "Amina, come here, my dear," she said. Amina came slowly, holding her bag close to her chest. "You look tired. Are you not feeling well?" Ruth asked kindly. Amina forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, teacher," she whispered. Ruth could tell that wasn't true, but she didn't want to push too hard. She just nodded and said, "If something is bothering you, you can always talk to me." Amina nodded again but said nothing. Later that afternoon, school ended early because of rain. Grace came to pick Amina up, but Daniel showed up instead. When Amina saw him standing near the school gate, her whole body froze. She looked like a bird caught in a net. Madam Ruth, standing near the staff room, noticed it. She watched Daniel smile widely, greeting other parents, pretending to be the perfect father. But Amina's face turned pale. That moment told Ruth everything she needed to know, even if no one had spoken a word. She waited until the next day and then met Grace at the market. Grace was arranging bananas and tomatoes neatly on her mat, calling out to customers with her usual bright smile. When she saw Ruth approaching, she greeted her warmly. "Ah, Teacher Ruth, you've come to buy from me today." Ruth smiled but didn't answer right away. "Grace," she said softly, "I want to talk to you about Amina." Grace stopped arranging her fruits and looked up. "Is she causing trouble?" she asked with a small laugh. "That girl is always too quiet these days." Ruth shook her head. "She's not in trouble. But I'm worried. She looks scared sometimes. Yesterday when Daniel came for her, she looked different. She looked frightened." Grace's smile faded. For a moment she didn't know what to say. Then she laughed lightly, though her voice sounded forced. "Oh, teacher, you don't need to worry. Daniel loves her like his own child. Maybe she was just tired." Ruth didn't push further. She only said, "Maybe. But please keep an eye on her. Sometimes silence means more than words." Then she left quietly, leaving Grace with a strange heaviness in her heart. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The rain tapped on the tin roof, but her mind was louder. She kept thinking about what Ruth had said. Could there really be something wrong? She remembered the times Amina looked nervous when Daniel entered the room, or when she quickly changed the topic whenever Grace mentioned him. At the time, Grace thought it was just shyness. But now, those memories felt different. Daniel came into the room later, smiling as always. "You're not sleeping, my dear?" he asked. Grace forced a small smile. "No, I'm just thinking about Amina," she said softly. "Teacher Ruth said she looks unhappy at school." Daniel laughed lightly. "Teachers like to talk too much. The girl is fine. Maybe she needs to stop reading sad books," he said, turning away. Grace nodded but still felt uneasy. Something about the way he spoke made her heart beat faster. The next morning, Grace decided to observe her daughter more closely. She noticed how Amina avoided Daniel's eyes during breakfast. When he offered her bread, she quickly shook her head. "No, thank you," she whispered, staring at the floor. Grace watched quietly, her spoon frozen in midair. After Daniel left for work, Grace sat beside her daughter. "Amina," she said softly, "Teacher Ruth told me you look sad in class. Is everything okay?" Amina's fingers played with the edge of her skirt. She nodded slowly but didn't meet her mother's eyes. "I'm fine, Mama," she said in a trembling voice. Grace wanted to believe her. She wanted to think everything was normal. But deep down, her heart whispered that something was not right. A mother's heart always knows, even when her mind refuses to listen. That afternoon, while cooking supper, Grace remembered when Amina was younger, how she used to sing loudly while washing dishes, how she ran to hug her mother when she came from the market. Now she barely smiled. Grace sighed deeply. She didn't want to imagine anything bad. She told herself that Amina was just growing up and becoming quiet like many teenage girls. But that night, when everyone was asleep, Grace woke up suddenly. She thought she heard footsteps in the corridor. Her heart pounded fast. She sat up and listened, but the sound stopped. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself. She tried to go back to sleep, but her thoughts kept running. She remembered Amina's frightened eyes, her weak voice, and the teacher's words, "Sometimes silence means more than words." The next day at school, Madame Ruth saw Amina sitting alone under a tree during break. She went to her and sat down. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," she said kindly. "I also kept quiet when I was hurting. But silence doesn't make pain disappear." Amina looked at her teacher with wide eyes. For a moment she wanted to speak. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then she whispered, "Thank you, teacher," and walked away slowly. Ruth watched her go, praying in her heart for strength to help her. Meanwhile, Grace continued to pretend everything was fine. She smiled at neighbors and cooked Daniel's favorite meals, but her heart was no longer calm. Every sound in the house made her nervous. She began watching Daniel carefully, noticing small things she had never paid attention to before, how he locked Amina's door sometimes when she was inside, how his voice softened too much when he talked to her. One evening, Grace called her daughter again. "Amina, if anything ever worries you, you can tell me, okay?" she said. Amina just nodded and whispered, "Yes, Mama." Grace wanted to hug her but didn't. She was scared to push her too hard. That night, the moonlight fell through the small window, lighting up Amina's face as she lay awake. In the next room, Grace sat silently on her bed, staring at the wall. Both of them were awake, both afraid, both trapped in silence. And while the wind blew gently outside, carrying the sound of distant drums and dogs barking in the dark, a quiet storm was beginning to rise inside Grace's heart. A storm of doubt, fear, and awakening. She didn't know what she would discover, but she knew one thing for sure. The whispers in the wind were no longer lies. They were warnings. The day began like any other. The sun rose softly over the hills, and the village slowly came to life. Children walked to school in their neat uniforms, their laughter mixing with the sound of morning birds. Amina walked quietly among them, holding her bag tightly. Her steps were slow, her face pale. She had not been sleeping well, and her body felt weak. At school, her teacher, Madame Ruth, noticed she looked even more tired than usual. During the first lesson, Amina tried to focus, but the letters on the blackboard began to blur. She held her head for a moment, then everything went dark. The whole class screamed as she collapsed to the floor. Madame Ruth ran to her side. "Amina. Amina, can you hear me?" she cried. But Amina didn't respond. The teacher called for help, and two other teachers carried her to the headmaster's office. Within minutes, they arranged for her to be taken to the small clinic near the market. When Grace received the message, she dropped everything she was doing at her market stall and ran. Her hands shook as she pushed through the crowd at the clinic. "Where is my daughter? Where is Amina?" she cried. A nurse led her to a small room where Amina lay on a narrow bed, her face pale and her eyes closed. Grace sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "My child, what happened? You were fine this morning," she whispered. The nurse entered the room with a clipboard, her face serious. "Mama, we need to talk," she said softly. Grace stood up quickly. "Tell me, is she sick? What is wrong?" The nurse hesitated, then said gently, "She fainted because she is weak. But there's something else. The test we ran shows that Amina is expecting a baby." The words hit Grace like thunder. For a moment she couldn't breathe. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible. She's only 15. Her voice trembled. The nurse looked down sadly. "I'm sorry, Mama. But it's true." Grace sank into the chair, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter. "Who did this to you, my child?" she whispered in a broken voice. Later that evening, when Amina finally woke up, her mother was sitting beside her, her face swollen from crying. "Amina," Grace said softly, "please tell me the truth. Who is responsible for this? Who hurt you?" Amina's lips trembled. She turned her face away, silent tears running down her cheeks. "Please, my daughter," Grace begged, holding her hands. Don't be afraid. I will protect you. Just tell me the truth. For a long time, Amina said nothing. Then, in a voice so small it was almost a whisper, she said, Mama, it was Daniel. Grace froze. She thought she had heard wrong. Who? She asked slowly. Amina's voice broke as she repeated, Daniel, Mama? It was Daniel. The room went silent. The world around Grace seemed to stop. She stared at her daughter in disbelief. Her heart began to race, her hands shaking. No, she said weakly. No, my husband would never. But deep inside, a part of her already knew the truth. All the strange signs, the fear in Amina's eyes, the silence, the uneasiness, they all came back to her now like painful flashes. Grace stood up suddenly, tears pouring down her face. She felt her body go weak. She wanted to scream but no sound came out. She grabbed the wall to steady herself. Oh God, she cried softly, what have I done? How could I not see this? Amina sobbed harder. I was scared, Mama, she said. I tried to tell you but I couldn't. He said no one would believe me. Grace fell to her knees beside the bed and held her daughter tightly. I believe you now, my child, she said between tears. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have seen it. They cried together, their tears mixing, one from pain, the other from guilt. For a long time neither of them spoke. Grace felt her whole world breaking apart. The man she trusted, the man everyone respected, had done something unforgivable. When the nurse returned to check on them, she found Grace sitting on the floor, staring blankly. The nurse touched her shoulder gently. You need to rest, she said. But Grace only shook her head. No, I need justice, she whispered. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Every memory of Daniel came back. The gifts he brought, the smile he wore, the way people admired him. Now all of it felt like poison. She realized how blind she had been. He fooled me, she said to herself. He fooled everyone. Outside, the crickets sang, but Grace could only hear her own heartbeat. She looked at her daughter sleeping beside her and made a silent promise. She would not stay silent anymore. The next morning she prepared a small bag. We are leaving this house, she told Amina. I will not spend another minute under the same roof with that man. Amina nodded weakly. Grace walked straight to her friend, Madame Ruth, and told her everything. Ruth listened in shock, her eyes filling with tears. Grace, she said firmly, you must go to the police. He cannot get away with this. At first, Grace hesitated. She was scared of what people would say. She knew the village would whisper. But then she looked at her daughter's face and felt her fear turn into anger. Let them talk, she said. I will not protect a monster. By the afternoon, she stood in front of the police station. Her hands trembled as she gave her statement. The officer listened quietly, taking notes. We will handle this, he said, though his eyes showed disbelief. Grace didn't care whether he believed her or not. She knew the truth and that was enough. When she returned home, Daniel was sitting outside, smiling as if nothing had happened. You're back early, he said. Grace looked at him coldly. For a moment, her silence frightened him. Then she said slowly, I know everything. Daniel's smile faded. What do you mean? He asked, his voice shaking slightly. Grace stepped closer, her eyes burning with tears and rage. You know what I mean. I know what you did to Amina. Daniel tried to speak, but she raised her hand. Don't you dare say another word, she said. The police are coming for you. Daniel's face turned pale. He stood up, trying to talk his way out, but before he could finish, Grace shouted, You destroyed my child. You destroyed this family. Her voice cracked, but her courage held strong. Within minutes, the sound of a motorbike came from the road. The police had arrived. Daniel tried to run, but the officers caught him. Grace stood in the doorway, holding Amina's hand tightly as they took him away. That night, for the first time in many months, the house was quiet. Truly quiet. No footsteps, no lies, no shadows. Only a mother and her daughter, sitting together, their hearts still broken but no longer afraid. Grace looked at Amina and whispered, It's over now, my child. I promise it's over. And though her heart still ached, she knew the truth had finally broken free, and with it, their chance to begin healing. The morning after everything was revealed, Grace woke up with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. Amina was still asleep beside her, holding her mother's hand tightly. Grace looked at her daughter's face, pale but peaceful, and whispered, You are safe now, my child. Then she stood up, washed her face, and prepared herself for what she had to do. The sun had just risen when she tied her headscarf and stepped outside. The road to the police station was long and dusty, but Grace walked with steady steps. Her feet trembled, but her heart was strong. She knew the path she was walking was not easy, but silence had already caused too much pain. When she reached the small police post, 2 officers were sitting outside, drinking tea. One of them looked up and said, "Madam, can we help you?" Grace nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I need to report something." Inside, she sat on a wooden chair and told them everything, from the day she noticed Amina's fear to the terrible truth her daughter had finally revealed. As she spoke, her voice shook, but she did not stop. The officers exchanged glances. One of them sighed and said, "Madam, are you sure about what you are saying?" "Daniel? That man is known here. He helps at the church. He's respected." Grace's hands clenched into fists. "Yes, I am sure," she said firmly. "He is respected, but he is also guilty. I was blind once, but I will not be silent again." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed strong. The officers hesitated. They were not used to hearing such things, especially against someone like Daniel. "We will investigate," one finally said. But Grace could tell they didn't fully believe her. Still, she stood up and said, "Please do your job. My daughter deserves justice." When she left the station, her heart was heavy, but her spirit felt lighter. She had spoken the truth, and that was the first step. She went straight to the school to meet Madame Ruth. When she arrived, Ruth was teaching a small group of students under the mango tree. She saw Grace and quickly walked over. "How is Amina?" she asked with concern. Grace sighed. "She is resting. I went to the police this morning." Ruth looked at her with admiration. "You are brave, Grace," she said. "You did the right thing." Later that afternoon, 2 officers arrived at Grace's home. Daniel was sitting outside pretending to read the newspaper. When he saw them, he smiled confidently. "Officers, what brings you here?" he asked politely. One of them replied, "We need to ask you some questions." Grace stood behind the officers, her heart pounding. Daniel looked at her sharply, his eyes full of disbelief. "You went to them?" he said in a low, angry voice. "After everything I've done for you?" Grace stared back. "You did nothing for me," she said quietly. "You destroyed my child's peace. You destroyed our home." Daniel tried to protest, but the officers didn't let him speak much longer. They told him to come with them. His neighbors began gathering around, whispering. Some were shocked. "Daniel? The church man?" they murmured. Others refused to believe it. "It can't be true," someone said. "He's always helping people." But Grace didn't care what they said. For years, people had praised him while her daughter suffered in silence. Now the truth was out. As the officers led Daniel away, Grace felt tears running down her face, not from sadness but from relief. The lie was finally broken. That evening, news spread quickly through the village. Some people came to Grace's house, pretending to offer comfort but mostly curious. "Grace," one woman said, "is it true? Daniel has been arrested." Grace nodded silently. Another woman shook her head. "Ah, what a shame. Who would have believed?" Grace didn't respond. She didn't have the strength to argue. She only said, "Evil can wear a friendly face. Be careful who you trust." Meanwhile, Amina stayed with Madame Ruth at the school staff quarters for a few days. Ruth made her tea and sat with her in the evenings talking softly. At first, Amina didn't speak much. She only looked down and played with her fingers. But slowly she began to open up. She started to smile again, though faintly. Ruth encouraged her to draw and write stories like she used to. "Your heart will heal, little one," Ruth said gently. "One day this pain will become your strength." Grace visited her daughter every evening. Each time she saw a small change, a bit more light in her eyes, a little more peace in her face. It gave Grace the courage to keep fighting. Days passed and the police investigation continued. At first, many people doubted Grace's story, but as more evidence came out, the truth became clear. The nurse at the clinic spoke, the teacher gave her statement, and finally, Amina herself found the courage to speak to the officers. When Daniel's trial began in the town court, Grace and Amina both attended. The courtroom was full of people from their village. Some came to support, others came just to see what would happen. Grace sat beside her daughter, holding her hand tightly. Amina trembled but stayed strong. When she took the stand, her voice was low but steady. She told her story without details, just enough for the truth to be known. The judge listened carefully. Grace watched her daughter and felt both pain and pride. This was not the same scared child she had seen crying in the dark. This was a girl finding her voice. After a long silence, the judge spoke. "Justice must be done," he said. "No one, no matter how respected, has the right to harm a child." When the sentence was given, Grace felt tears run down her cheeks again. The room was silent except for her quiet sobs. She turned to Amina and whispered, "It's over now, my child. It's really over." In the following weeks, Grace began to rebuild her life. The villagers who had once gossiped started to look at her with respect. Some came to apologize. Others kept their distance, ashamed for not believing her sooner. Grace forgave them but didn't forget. She joined a women's group started by Madame Ruth, where they talked about protecting children and supporting mothers. Grace shared her story openly, saying, "If silence can hide evil, then speaking up can save a life." Amina continued her studies, this time in a different school in a nearby town. Though she still carried scars in her heart, she began to dream again. She told her mother one day, "I want to become a teacher like Madame Ruth, someone who listens when a child is quiet." Grace smiled proudly, her eyes full of love. Their home was no longer filled with fear but with peace. Grace planted flowers near the door, saying, "Let new life grow where pain once lived." Every morning when the sun rose, she looked up and whispered a small prayer of thanks, not for what had happened but for the strength to survive it. And so, in that small Ugandan village, the story of Grace and Amina became a lesson for everyone. People learned that truth can be buried for a while, but it never dies. It always finds its way to the light, just as Amina did. Months passed and the rains returned to the village. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Grace's small house, once filled with silence and sorrow, now carried the sound of laughter again. Amina was healing little by little. She still had quiet days when her eyes turned distant, but there was strength in her that no one could take away. Grace often sat outside in the evenings watching her daughter read under the fading sunset, and she would whisper softly, "God gave me back my child." One morning, Grace received a letter from the Women's Association in town. They were hosting a gathering for mothers, teachers, and young girls, a meeting to talk about safety, courage, and the power of listening. They had heard about Grace and Amina's story. They wanted her to speak. At first, Grace hesitated. "What can I say?" she asked Madame Ruth, who was sitting with her under the mango tree. Ruth smiled gently. "You can say the truth," she said. "That is enough. Your story has already saved lives, Grace. Now it can save more." Grace thought about it for days. She remembered the night she had found out the truth, the shame she had felt for not seeing her daughter's pain, and the long road to justice. She also remembered the kindness that came afterward, from Ruth, from the few women who stood by her, and from the strangers who sent letters saying, "You gave me courage to speak." So she decided to go. On the morning of the gathering, she dressed simply, wearing a bright yellow wrapper that Amina had bought for her from the market. Amina insisted on going along. "I want to be there, Mama," she said softly. Grace looked at her daughter, taller now, calmer, wiser, and nodded. "Then we will go together." When they arrived, the hall was full of women, young, old, and in between. Some carried babies on their backs, others came with notebooks, ready to listen. There were teachers, nurses, traders, and even a few fathers who wanted to learn. The air was warm and filled with quiet anticipation. Grace sat at the front, waiting for her turn. Her heart pounded, but she reminded herself why she was there. When her name was called, she stood and walked slowly to the stage. The room fell silent. She looked around at the faces before her, faces of women who had struggled just like her. Then she began to speak. "When pain comes to a home," she said softly, "it does not always come from outside. Sometimes it comes from those we trust the most." Her voice trembled for a moment, but she did not stop. "I was once blind. My daughter was crying and I did not see it. I told myself she was just growing up, but she was breaking inside. I was busy working, trying to feed her, but I forgot to listen to her heart." The room was so quiet that even the sound of breathing seemed loud. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "One day I found out the truth and it crushed me. But I learned something: silence only helps evil. When you speak, when you stand, even when you tremble, you open the door for light to come in." She paused, her eyes glistening. "We must listen to our children," she said. "We must protect them even from those we trust. We must believe them when they say they are not okay. A child's silence is a mother's call to look closer." As she spoke, many women began to wipe their eyes. Some held their children tighter. Others nodded slowly, their faces filled with understanding. Grace felt tears too, but they were not from pain, they were from release. For the first time, she was not just telling her story, she was turning it into a message. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Some women came forward to hug her, whispering, "Thank you. You spoke for many of us." Grace smiled gently and said, It is not my voice alone. It is every mother who dares to face the truth. Amina, sitting in the front row, stood up and walked to her mother. She held her hand and smiled faintly. "You were brave, Mama," she said. Grace looked at her daughter lovingly and replied, "No, my child. We were brave." After the event, many women stayed behind to talk to them. One young girl came forward, tears running down her cheeks. "I have something to tell my mother," she whispered. Grace hugged her and said, "Tell her. Don't be afraid." That day something powerful happened. More voices began to rise. As they walked home that evening, the sky turned orange and pink. Amina carried a small basket of fruit that someone had given them. "Mama," she said quietly, "I think what you said today will help others." Grace smiled. "That is why we tell the truth," she replied. "Pain can grow flowers if we plant it in courage." When they reached home, Grace placed a new pot of flowers near their doorway. Amina knelt beside her to help. "What will we call them?" she asked. Grace thought for a moment and said, "Hope," because that is what survived. In the following months, Grace became a counselor at the Women's Center. She spoke to young mothers, widows, and even teenage girls. She taught them how to notice the quiet signs: a child who no longer plays, a smile that disappears too quickly, a silence that feels too heavy. She told them, "Don't wait for a scream. Listen to the silence." Amina continued her schooling and began helping Madame Ruth with young students who had troubles at home. She was patient and kind, and she never judged. One day Ruth told Grace, "Your daughter has a gift. She understands hearts." Grace smiled proudly and replied, "She was born from pain, but she lives in strength." Years later, when people spoke about Grace and Amina, they didn't just remember their suffering, they remembered their courage. Their story spread far beyond their village. It became a lesson shared in schools, in churches, in community meetings. And every time a mother stopped to truly listen to her child, Grace's words echoed quietly in the background. In the same village where darkness once lived in their home, light now grew. Children played freely in the yard where Amina used to cry in silence. Grace often sat by the window watching them, her heart full. She had once thought her story was only about pain, but now she knew it was also about power. The power of a mother's love, the strength of truth, and the courage to speak. That night, as she and Amina sat outside under the stars, Grace whispered, "Do you see how far we've come?" Amina leaned against her shoulder and said, "Yes, Mama. And we'll keep going." Grace smiled at the sky, feeling the cool wind brush her face. "Let them all hear our story," she murmured, "so that no child ever cries alone again." The moon rose high, shining softly over the quiet village, over the home that had turned from sorrow to peace, and over the two hearts that had found their way from darkness into light.